Good morning, everyone. We're going to be starting our Bible class today. We are in the gospel, not gospel, but we're in the book of Acts, chapter 14, and we're looking at verses 8 to 20 today. And I want to thank you for all of you that are joining us in our online Bible class at this time. We're thankful that you are with us, and I hope that you have been following along with us as we have continued to try to adapt to our format here online, and thankful so much for the support and encouragement that we receive from everyone. But what we're looking at here is the Apostle Paul engaging with his mission field, and in chapter 14 we see him continuing on this journey, and he's really in the middle of this great journey as the gospel now, under his leadership, has gone into Asia Minor, has gone and spread out into the Greco-Roman world a bit further now. We don't want to forget that there were many people from all over the world that had come to Jerusalem to hear the gospel. They didn't come for that specific reason, but they had come because of Pentecost. And so these Jews that were living away from Jerusalem, away from the land of promise, who were living out away from their homeland, they are not exiles. They are called the diaspora, which is just to say the scattered ones. And now Paul is connecting with those, and he is looking for synagogues to preach in. Today, what we're going to be looking at is his activity in Lystra, or Lystra, if you like. What we want to look at here is first the text, and we're going to read from the New King James, and we'll be using a different text as we go through the material ourselves. But in Acts chapter 14, verse 8 to 20, it reads like this. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up, straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw that what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with you, with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without a witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness." And with these sayings they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. Okay, so looking at this text, we are looking at the situation in Lystra, and it is a pretty engaging and interesting story. It has a lot of interesting factors to it. I'm going to take a little bit of time here to look at some of the background here, just a little bit, perhaps enough to enlighten the text a little bit. This is a mound. You might say, "Wow, a picture of a hill," but but most likely this mound is the remains, which is a pretty common sight in the ancient world. These mounds throughout the ancient world are often archaeological sites. This is one of those locations that hasn't been really dug out. Um, Archaeology is a wonderful tool to understand the sort of external issues of Bible places and Bible times. Many times we have opportunities to gain insight from coins or pottery. Sometimes we can are able to look at cities and at least the outline of their cities. Sometimes we're able to see temples and all sorts of things. But here, uh, with this particular city, uh, Lystra is one of the last few cities that has not been dug out and studied. So it remains to be one of those cities that we know we can gain a great deal of information, but for many reasons, sometimes political, sometimes religious, all sorts of things to factor in, funding. Uh, this particular city has not been dug. However, it is important to recognize that there was a time in which the city itself was not viewed to be a historical place, an actual place, and that has been dispelled for over 100 years by famous British archaeologist Sir William Ramsay, who himself spent time in Asia Minor trying to debunk the historical accuracy of the book of Acts, arguing the case that he believed that there's no way that the author of Acts could be accurate in the details, and he walked away becoming a believer in the historicity of the book of Acts. At any rate, you do see some coinage. If you look at the bottom right, you'll see a coinage there, and you could see animals, sort of like ox, and they seem to be like beasts of burden. You can also see on the top Augustus, the Augustii coins that were minted for Lystra. So here you have Caesar Augustus coins for the city of Lystra, another example of the city's historical roots, that it is an actual place. Okay, so as we look at the text and start considering some of the things from the text, I do want to point out that as they travel from Iconium to Lystra, and this is approximately about 20 something miles, more toward 21-ish. And so they travel and they arrive at Lystra, and as they come to this city, we're not given a lot of detail here. But what we are given is this episode where Paul engages a crippled man. This is very similar to the sort of situation where we find Peter when he comes into the temple at Jerusalem, where he finds a crippled man. And perhaps this was a common method of creating an opportunity to teach the gospel, to heal a man. And so as Peter does so in Acts chapter 4, we also see this happening, in Acts chapter 3, we also see this happening here in Acts chapter 14. Paul seeing this man who, interestingly enough, he had faith to be made well. This is one of those passages that demonstrate that healing sometimes apparently was connected to a person's willingness to trust, perhaps trust in God, trust in God's prophet, whatever the case may be. It is not the only time people are healed. It is not the only time people are healed with faith. Sometimes they're healed or a miracle is done on them apart from their faith. So faith here, it becomes an integral part here. The activity hinges on the man's faith. Why does he have faith? We do not know. It could be that he, like other people before him, had heard things about the Christians, had heard about Paul. Um, Paul's visit to Iconium, about where he's coming from. There will be people, there will be Jews from the synagogue in that area, um, who come from Antioch and Iconium. They will be people from there. So word did spread, word did get around. Obviously, if the Jews from those cities, Antioch and Iconium, are going to, they heard that Paul was in Lystra, and 20 miles was not exactly a difficult walk to hoof. So it's possible that here is this man, perhaps interested in hearing about miracle workers, hearing about the potential of being made healed, being made whole. And while we don't see um, all of those interactions, it's possible. The other textual argument, though, okay, I only bring up some possibilities here, but the other textual issue, of course, is that he listened to Paul speaking. Now, what was the content of that message? We don't know. But what was Paul preaching the gospel about? He was preaching about resurrection. He was preaching about Jesus Christ, the resurrected Jesus, the resurrected one, someone who had died, was buried, and rose again. Now, what would that tell a crippled person, a man who had never walked before? I would argue that perhaps it gave him enough hope that if God can raise up a dead person, surely he can raise up a crippled person who had never walked. And that is probably where his faith really emerged from. No telling what he had heard beforehand, and maybe that's why he gave Paul any attention, or maybe it was just inadvertent. He just couldn't avoid hearing Paul speak. Whatever the case is, he did hear Paul. Paul's message was about a resurrected Jesus who had been killed, slain, crucified, and now, with enough faith to be made well, he is told by Paul, "Stand upright on your feet." That's a really powerful moment. And immediately he springs up and begins walking. Now, the powerful thing here is the way the text describes this miracle. And I bring this up as a Christian who is interested in miracles, as a Christian who believes that God is free to heal whenever God feels like healing. It's just within his power. It is within his right. But at the same time, there is a distinction between God's people who are empowered by the Spirit of God to do such a thing, and so there was this distinction I would make here. God, who is always God, doing such things, healing. We pray to God to do such things, don't we? But then there's also when God had particular spokesmen with an understanding that these things were more possible through them than not. So the signs or miracles that follow, like apostles or prophets, is what I'm getting at here. I am one of those that do not believe that manifestation of the miraculous exists today. I am not one that subscribes that God doesn't do anything. I'm just saying through spokesmen uniquely called and have a sense of trust that such things can still happen through them at will. Those are the things that I'm saying that do not happen today. But at any rate, when you study this and you give some careful attention, Paul doesn't do this in a whisper. Paul does this, verse 10, in a loud voice. The miracle is called upon, right? I don't know if he calls out to the Lord, lifting his hand up, whatever it is, but what we do find here is Paul lifting his voice loud, most likely for people to hear, perhaps to pay attention. And he says, stand upright on your feet. Man, what a powerful, powerful thing. What a powerful moment. Because the text says he springs up and begins walking. Now, the contrast, remember, crippled from birth, never able to walk. In the ancient world, there were no handicap, tools or technologies. If you were not able to walk, you had to make do with what people thought you could or couldn't do, or where you needed to sit and wait for the assistance of others, and you were not contributing to society usually. That is the general picture of the ancient world. There was no American Disability Acts for them, no funding, etc. So in many ways, Paul now gives to this man, we don't know how old he is, he gives to this man the ability to enter society as a full, complete person. He gives this man the ability. And by doing that, by allowing him to have the ability to contribute, to work, to not be dependent, he has given him an opportunity to, in a sense, to restore his humanity. And I'm not saying he had no human value. The the Third Reich of the Nazis, they viewed people with disabilities as, just people that siphoned off society and needed to be, removed from society. And we have, even in modern times, a similar view, but we do it before babies are born. At any rate, this man was given the ability to walk, and as a result, you see that it was done quickly. And here's my point about that. Getting back to what I wanted to say is the miracle was done immediately. It wasn't done later, down the road, after he saw a doctor. It wasn't done later during a light show. It wasn't done with fanfare like that. And it was immediate. The miracle was in the moment. Now, I'd argue that is a very different phenomenon than modern day would-be miracle workers. A different phenomenon, and we need to be mindful of that. And documented miracles around the world, we need to be mindful of that as well. Claims to miracles around the world, was it instantaneous? Did it go from having no limb to having limbs? Did atrophied muscles rehabilitate in a moment and become healthy muscle tissue, healthy tendons, healthy cartilage, strong bones, fully, given all the nutrients that it needs to be strong, viable, bone and cartilage and ligament, all of that stuff? Is that what we're talking about? Those are the things that we need to be mindful of. But that's exactly what we're going to claim here about what happens to this man. And as a result, and while they may not be thinking on these terms, all they see is a man who had been crippled since birth, which means he is described in such a way where he was a community member. People knew him. People knew the crippled man. People know they're homeless people. Even if you don't talk to them, you know the kind of people you see in the community that are homeless or begging, and you know who they are, and you know what corners they usually have. They have their little posts where they stand there. You know that. And to see a person that you would cross paths, know them their whole life, and see them in this way, and now they're standing, now they're moving, you know something powerful has just happened. And that's the sort of experience that I want us to understand here when it comes to the miracle of Paul. And why then Why then the Lycaonians, right? The Lycaonians, okay, um, why they respond with uplifted voices, right? Paul's voice, lifted loud, is now, responded to by their loud voice. And this is, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And they rename Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas they call Zeus, and Paul they call Hermes. And the distinction is, and we're going to get to this in just a second, but the distinction is because Paul is the chief speaker. And apparently there was a temple. Every major city had temple or many temples, and because you had, and we'll get to this also, um, religions, or family gods, and then community gods, and then national gods, etc. But here locally, they had a temple of Zeus, whose temple was in the entrance of the city, and they have the whole system set up, and they come out to honor him. This is again a demonstration of the magnitude of what happens through Paul's connection to God as a miracle worker and an apostle to heal this man. It is such a phenomenal act and power that they respond with the only kind of worldview that is at their disposal at this moment and say, the gods have come down. We look at Acts 17 as, what do Christians do in a world where they don't believe in a scripture? Paul argues from natural theology, poetry, the writings, and philosophy. He appeals to those things to get the Athenians at least to give him an audience. Throughout the book of Acts, Paul usually preaches in synagogues, and he preaches and he preaches and he preaches from what? Scripture. The text that Jews in the synagogues would acknowledge as authoritative for their knowledge of God. But here in Acts 14, what we end up seeing is another model where a powerful demonstration of miraculous ability is on display. And the only conclusion that the locals have is the gods have done something. So let's honor the gods as such. Now, this idea of the gods coming down in the likeness of men is part of Greek mythology. And just to give you a quick little background here, this is the peak of Mount Olympus. Now, Mount Olympus is not very close to this area, but I wanted to give you a sense of an aerial view of Mount Olympus. And what I want you to think about here is, this is the place where the gods are supposed to dwell. This is the peak. This is the pantheon. This is the sort of home of the gods. This is where they go when they're not dwelling among men. They're above the clouds. They're beyond human touch, and so forth and so on. Yet, it was part of Roman and Greek mythology that Zeus, or the gods themselves, but Zeus in particular, there's many, 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 many stories, and some of them very atrocious, but many stories about Zeus coming down in the form of a human or the form of an animal, like a sheep, and he seduces women and sleeps with them. But the point is, it wasn't beyond the Greeks or Greek and Roman religions to believe that their gods, who dwell, on Mount Olympus or in the heavens, that they would not come down. It's not beyond the gods to come down in the form of human beings. So it's in their mythology, it's in their writings, and so they had part of this worldview that Zeus, and even the story, Ovid writes a story in his Metamorphosis, that Zeus and Hermes visited this particular region, and being rejected by the region. And so perhaps it is, as some have considered, I think Michael Parsons in his commentary on Acts talks about that perhaps this is their way of making right with them. Not sure. That's only speculation. But it's important to realize that Zeus and Hermes are intimately connected to this place, and they have this great temple of Zeus. And while I'm not going to delve into all the mythology of Zeus here, you can look at this later, but it's really interesting to notice that the role that Zeus has in Greek mythology, and how um, he saves the other gods, and he is able to become influential. And Zeus was worshipped in most family homes, and there was often an altar dedicated to him in each courtyard. And sometimes he'd be called Zeus, Herchaos, Herchaos, and he protected the family hearth and the property in general. So Zeus was sort of this protector. Zeus was like a savior, a preserver, and so lots of different connections to Zeus himself. Different ways that the ancients regarded him. Soter, which had been protector. Soter would be the Greek word for savior. So he was the great benefactor of all, and often the equivalent to Jupiter. So, um, that being the case, he was the great one, the great protector. Now, meanwhile, Hermes was also an significant god. He's the sort of next generation gods, and this is a statue. I did not put the full statue because he is not clothed, and as is typical of ancient Greek statue, there are no clothes, and he is a full male. Uh, so, um, at any rate, Hermes had the ability of, he was the one that would sort of be a messenger. He was winged. Sometimes his wings are placed at his ankles, and which allows him to fly. Even modern comic books take after that. The Marvel hero Namor, who is sort of the Marvel version of Aquaman, he has wings on his ankles also, and allows him to fly out of the water. But at any rate, Hermes was considered a trickster, but he was beloved among the gods. He supposedly the inventor of music, like the lyre. And so Hermes, though, functioned not only as a messenger of the gods, but supposedly he is the inventor of speech. And so it is his name that is the foundation for understanding or interpretation of knowledge, or interpretation of speech, particularly written speech now, which is where we get the word hermeneutics. So Hermes is sort of the foundation for those thinkings. And so what I'm saying here is, having a temple of Zeus, having this backdrop of mythology, having this backdrop of this written mythological story that Zeus and Hermes had once come and been rejected, and on and so forth and so on. And now this great, powerful, miraculous moment has happened, where a born crippled is now healed and able to walk and able to engage and be a part of society again. It is a phenomenal reaction that the locals are. They stick to what they know, their Greek or Roman religion. And um, as I have a couple notes here, the large temples of Zeus were the exception as far as can be told. In other words, temples were not always huge. They were sometimes, modest size. And the worship of the Olympians was merely the official state cult, and conformity to it served as a test of an individual's patriotism. So, do you believe in the gods? Yes. Do you worship them? Well, prove it. And so there would be these opportunities. Similar things happen eventually to the Caesars, the emperor cult, and we see that happening even in Bithynia, in Asia Minor, Northeast Asia Minor, as a test for Christians if they will make the vow and offer it to the image of Caesar. Um, I wanted to give you a sense. This is just a spatial way of understanding something that I want to point out. In the Greco-Roman world, you had different ways. You have different connections to religion. This is not perhaps as definitive as it could be, but this is just to give you a sense. You had family, you would have your family gods, you might have your community gods, perhaps your local ancestry or your heritage or your local area. Then you'd have the Greek gods who eventually become Roman gods with new names. That's why you will find, Zeus will having two names, Zeus and Jupiter. But also, you would have mystery religions, and that was sometimes looked down on, and sometimes they'd be like underground religions. And then you eventually have the state of Rome or Roma would be worshipped as a nation. So the the land itself, the nation had its own spirit, its own God-esque sense to it, and you worshipped it. It is sometimes akin to modern day patriotism, where we might love, for example, the sentiment of our nation so much that it almost becomes a driving force or something we submit to. It is possible to turn the essence of a country into an idol. So we have to be careful. And then, of course, there was the emperor cult. All of these religions seem to have sort of an allowed interaction or interplay. And then you have the Jewish religion, which was completely different. All those deities you can worship, you can align with, you can overlap with mystery religions. No space here. I haven't put any space here for any philosophies, but in essence, the Greco-Roman world was very pluralistic, allowed for many different things. The Jewish religion was the exception. Monotheism was the core, and that is what Paul is sharing the gospel from that foundation of one God. Okay, so when we think then about Paul and Barnabas and the reaction, then they stop cold turkey, or they try to stop them cold in their feet or in their tracks, and try to get Paul and Barnabas try to get the priests to stop doing what they're doing. And Paul and Barnabas do what they're accustomed to doing in their Semitic setting. They ripped their garments. They tore their clothes. They did this great physical demonstration of, it might even look kind of kooky. You might even like scratch your head if someone was so disappointed or upset or shocked at something you did, and they just ripped their clothes open in front of you. You might today think, wow, there's something really weird about this person. What in the world? And the idea here, of course, was part of it was to get their attention, but it was also a sad sense of no, we're not trying to elicit idolatry. We're not trying to encourage you to practice these pagan religions. We're not trying to get you to worship to Zeus. No, that is not what we're asking you to do. And this is not as refined, and I don't mean this negatively here, but this response is not as refined, and it could be just the nature of the situation. This is not a real speech. What I mean is there's perhaps no, rhetorical or oratorial sort of, complexity to what they're saying here. But Barnabas and Paul rush out, cry out. You can almost imagine, why are you doing these things? We are just men. We are just people. We're just like you. We know that you have this invested interest in the gods, but we are not the gods. We are just like you. But we are here to talk to you about gospel. We are bringing you a great message, a good news, a word of victory. Now, sometimes we might think that gospel or good news was a a church term. The church did not invent the word gospel. In fact, the church didn't invent any language. It just seized upon the language of the ancient world. And because that's the only language they had to use, right? So, but they coined new meanings with these common terms. Gospel could be a message of victory from a battle. It carries that notion of our God or our King is victorious, and let us tell you the great news about these great deeds that have happened. And so Paul and Barnabas, or Barnabas and Paul, they're saying, look, no, don't worship us. We're not a part of this Greek system, this Roman system. We're here to tell you a message of victory, or the message that comes forth from a victory from a living God. The message is this: that you should turn from these vain things. Now imagine they're pointing back to the animals. They're pointing back to the temple of Zeus. And they're saying, we have come to bring you a message of victory that flows out in such a way that you should walk away, turn around, and about face from those things to a living God. To a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And so this living God argument is couched in that way because the contrast is Zeus and everybody. They're not living. They don't actually live on Mount Olympus. In all practicality, they're just dead. They're not animate. They're figments of your imagination. Your gods are dead in that sense. And the contrast, again, as I'd shown before, the religion that Paul is showing them is the Jewish, I'm using this in a popular sense, the Jewish God, or the God of heaven and earth, the only God. And as the Old Testament scriptures of the Hebrew Bible would reveal, that God does not share heaven with anyone, because there is no other God to share heaven with. And so we get through this, and Paul says, or Barnabas, they both are trying to get this point across, that in the past, God has allowed all this. He has not intervened in these religions. He has not intervened or demanded of these people, them in particular, and allowed them to walk in their own ways. Even so, he was still in their lives. Okay, it's not that God was co-signing on Greek and Roman mythology and their gods. He wasn't saying, okay, cool, but he tolerated it, and yet he provided for them the same care that he provides for all people everywhere. And this is what Paul or Barnabas use as evidence that he has not left himself without a witness. Verse 17. What is the witness that God has left behind? It is an argument from natural theology. That is to say that you can look at the world around you and see certain elements about God. This being the case, a few of the things that we see about God is that he provides. Incidentally, this is a strike against Zeus. This is a significant strike against all the gods who had different responsibilities, shared different roles with managing the universe, the cosmos, and it's not done by a group of gods. It's done by the one God. God gave you rains from heaven. God gave you fruitful seasons. God gave you food and the resulting gladness. It was the one God, the living God, not the pantheon from Mount Olympus. And the evidence here, right? The reason why they should even give this case any attention is the miracle done by Paul. If Paul doesn't do the miracle, there really is no reason to listen to him on this point. If Paul doesn't take a known cripple from birth, that perhaps all of them in their small community had seen, known, cared for, nursed throughout this person's life, fed perhaps. If Paul does not heal that person, there's no weight whatsoever to these words. Okay, so how do you get people who don't share your point of view, your worldview, and get them to pay attention to this message? Well, you do a miracle. You do a miracle. You do something that only a messenger of God could do, would do. You give them a reason to believe that you've come from God. Nevertheless, they were unsuccessful. It says that even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. You know, and I've imagined in my mind this whole thing moving so quickly, but I've never been around an animal that's been slain. I don't know how long it takes, especially in the ancient world. You think about ceremonies and you think about preparations, and I just don't know how long. But the words of Barnabas and Paul, they don't go anywhere. They don't influence them enough. So as we get close to these words, to the end of our section here, I want to, I'm not going to cover this. I have a large section here on this word of turning back, but I just want to point out a few quick things as we close here. The idea that God wants the people to turn away. I mentioned it earlier, this turning. It's the same. It is the verb for conversion, what we might use for conversion. Literally, it could be turn back or to return, turn towards, or an about face. And so I have a few examples of how this word can be translated and is translated in the English Standard Version. But again, in many cases, this verb is about, an action that happens within a person's life, heart, and mind, that it is redirected away from, maybe idolatry, maybe sin, some other thing that keeps their life away from God, and it turns them around to the living God. And I have a few verses we can look at. Verse 14, chapter 14, verse 15, and 15, verse 19. Some words here. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God. And this is at the sort of the quote unquote Jerusalem Council, and how the brethren, the Christians in Jerusalem, they don't want to trouble them with extra laws or anything like that. These people that have turned to God, right? And so, as we close, I just want to point out what Paul does here. He preaches in the synagogue earlier, but then when he comes to a city where there is no synagogue, but he wants to reach out to them, he does teach and he does perform a miracle. It provides an opportunity, and he uses natural theology to prove that God has always been there for them. He's not introducing to them technically a new God on paper, because God of creation of heaven and earth has always been there. They probably just didn't know it yet. And he wants to introduce them to that God, the God of the resurrection, the God of the man healed. And so this is all interrupted uh, from these Jews that had come from Iconium. And as a result, they also traveled this 20-something miles from Iconium to Lystra. And they apparently had influence and persuaded the crowds. And these people end up stoning Paul, dragging him out, and leaving for dead. And it's just part of the day in the life of the Apostle Paul, unfortunately. And in this, we see Paul's willingness, dedication to the cause. And again, highlights, if Paul just made all this up, why go through all this? Why go through all this? And I know that could be abused. We can look at figures of history that believe really horrific things. I think of David Koresh and all that, but it's still a legitimate question. It's still a legitimate question. Why go through all this? He didn't have to, especially when he didn't reap any benefits from it and kept putting himself in harm's way. At any rate, verse 20, a group of Christians called disciples gathered about him, picked him up, and entered the city, and then he leaves. I want to close with this here. If you haven't noticed, verse 20 is a powerful, 19 and 20 are powerful echoes of Jesus Christ. Paul is rejected. Okay, he comes, brings a message of truth, and as a result, it is these diaspora Jews from another city, and they come, persuade the people in some sort of riot, this crowd, and they stone him. They attempt to kill Paul, and then the disciples gather around him, and he rises from this supposed death, returns to the city that tried to kill him, and then leaves to go to another place. If that's not a mirror of the sufferings of Christ that Paul often talks about, I don't know what is. He leaves behind a group of disciples who carry on. We don't hear about this church. There's no letter that we have on file that is written to them, but they are encouraged, and they continue on. We don't know for how long. Well, I hope that this study through Acts 14, verses 8 to 20, has been encouraging to you, has given you help to appreciate the labors of Paul and the dangerous things that he goes through, the times that he gets misconfused for a god, the god of Hermes, the communicating God, and yet, despite a demonstration of power to heal a crippled man, it doesn't seem to stop not only pagan sacrifices, but persecution that comes their way. A small group of disciples is left behind as Paul travels 80 miles with Barnabas to Derbe. So, Paul moves on. He keeps going forward. Keep moving forward. We all go through difficult hardships, different things. We have to keep learning to keep moving forward, even when we are hurt and wounded. And it's especially hard when you're doing it for the right reasons. You're going through it unjustly because you're trying to share Christ. And I pray for you, and I hope that you won't give up and follow Paul's example. Of all things he was inspired to say, he was not inspired to have courage. He developed courage on his own, and that's something we can aspire to as well. God bless you, and may the study bless you. We'll see you next time.